This is WWE 13. It's considered to be one of the best WWE games made in years. Graphically, the game is really impressive, and the in-ring action tries to capture what it's really like in real life very well. It's amazing to see how WWE games have evolved over the years, but let's take a trip down memory lane just to see what WWE games used to be like. So in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at some of the older WWE games that I happen to still own. Let's start with WrestleMania for the Super Nintendo. Right off the bat, we're in trouble because of this logo that pops up, LJN. Isn't that just a great way to start this review by starting with a game that's made by a company that had a reputation for making horrible games? Unfortunately, the game lives up to that reputation. The game looks okay for the most part. It's not the best looking SNES game you'll ever find, but it at least looks tolerable compared to most games. Also, the music, despite not being great, is pretty cool too. What ruins the experience? The controls. These have got to be the most delayed controls I've ever dealt with, and the sad part is, there isn't a huge move list, so there's no excuse. If you hit the button rapidly, you're only going to get a few punches out of it, and there's a huge delay from tapping the button to when it appears on screen. Fast forward to the follow-up, Royal Rumble, and all of this is fixed. The controls are much more fluent. The game looks almost identical to WrestleMania with only a few changes made, but the faster animation speed and the better controls do make it a much better game. However, the Royal Rumble match, I don't recommend. LJN tries to be innovative by getting 6 wrestlers into the ring at one time, which for that point in time was quite a feat. However, because this game is very much shown from a side perspective and is a 2D game rather than a 3D game, it comes across rather lousy. Not only does the game appear to slow down a bit when all of these wrestlers are in the ring, but you can hardly see what you're doing. The game also doesn't make it clear on what you have to do in order to throw someone over the top rope. I tried every button combination I can think of, but couldn't figure it out. I was only able to throw someone over the top rope once, and I honestly have no clue how I did it. On a side note, this was the first wrestling game that I recall that allowed you to use weapons. After LJN was folded by Acclaim would take over the series. I'm not sure whether any of the same people who worked on the previous games with LJN were handling these as well, but it's possible. One of the first efforts made under Acclaim was the console version of the hit arcade game, WrestleMania, the arcade game. This is a weird one. It's kind of a cross between pro wrestling and Mortal Kombat, but I would be lying if I said it wasn't a little bit fun. Yes, it is extremely odd for a wrestling game, but it's cool in its design. The music is cool and the graphics for the time are really nice. I have no clue what separates this port from the original arcade version. I've heard that the arcade version was better, and I'm pretty sure it was, but this is okay. It's playable and it's very fast-paced, which makes it a pretty intense experience. Acclaim would then take the series in a different direction in the late 90s with WWF War Zone. War Zone brought the series into the 3D world and introduced a whole new style of gameplay. They presented a rather button-mashing type of gameplay where each move was executed by hitting a certain button combination. Considering that it was their first effort trying this, it turned out pretty good. There wasn't a great deal of match selection in this game. For the most part, it was pretty basic. However, this game did come up with sort of a career mode where you go through the rankings to get to the top and go through several matches. The game doesn't feature a big list of wrestlers. It only shows the top wrestlers, and that's about it. This game was obviously in development for a while because it still features Bret Hart, whom at this point was with WCW after a bad fallout with the WWF. Graphically, this was definitely one of the best wrestling games that came out at the time. The character models looked good, and they gave each wrestler a personality that matched the personalities of the wrestlers they were trying to recreate. The next game, WWF Attitude, would try to continue this style of gameplay, but expand on it slightly. With Attitude, the gameplay is still the same, but there were other features added elsewhere, for instance, full entrances, and there's also a lot more voice work with the wrestlers themselves. I myself was never a big fan of Attitude. While the gameplay was still very much the same as before, they seemed to slow it down a bit for the player. The AI is much more responsive in Attitude than it was in War Zone, which is kind of a double-edged sword with the button-mashing concept of the game. You're not given a lot of time to respond, and the AI seems to recover a lot faster from moves than the player does, so that's a little bit of a problem. Graphically, the game looks great for the time. The entrances look great, and the overall look of the wrestling moves and holds are pretty darn accurate despite the limitations of the physics engines back then. So Attitude, the many ideas that they came up with were very innovative, but the speed of the wrestling and the AI needed to be improved. And this will lead us into our next game, which is WWF Smackdown. After Attitude, WWF's long-running contract with Acclaim had ended and they signed on with THQ. The really crazy part about this is that their rival, WCW, was signed on to THQ as well. WWF literally waited until WCW's contract had expired and immediately signed with THQ. It seems rather underhanded, but when you look at how personal that rivalry got, it's not surprising. THQ brought along Ukes to develop the game, and Ukes changed around the graphical look and the overall gameplay and made this game as different as they possibly could from all the previous WWF titles. Smackdown introduced a much faster and more intense gameplay setup. The button-mashing combinations of War Zone and Attitude were long gone, and taking its place was a much more simple setup. Moves now required very little button hitting to do. For instance, whipping an opponent into the corner or into the ropes only required one button instead of dealing with several buttons. Finishers were also made easier just by hitting the L1 button on the controller. This gameplay setup gave SmackDown a rather arcade feel to it, which actually worked in the game's favor. Matches no longer took 20 minutes or more and could easily be finished in 5 or less minutes. This gave SmackDown a lot of replay value. The game also introduced a season mode, which tested the waters for the career mode that we would see later on. It's not perfect by any means, and the cutscenes are more random than anything else, but for one of the early season modes, it's not bad at all. The game also features backstage battles, which was really cool at the time. There are still AI problems with this game. For one, wrestlers recover way too fast and get up quickly from a lot of high-impact blows. There was one match in particular where I did 5 finishers and yet my opponent still kicked out. Graphically, the game was a huge improvement. This was probably the most realistic-looking wrestling game ever to come out on the PlayStation. The entrances, however, took a bit of a dive. Because the game was so graphically demanding on the PlayStation, they had to tone down the entrances, so they weren't full entrances. They were just the wrestlers walking with their entrance videos in the background. So overall, Smackdown was definitely worth checking if you were a gamer. You didn't just have to be a wrestling fan to play this one. Smackdown 2 released only 8 months after the first Smackdown. According to rumors, the reason why it released so fast was because Ukes was developing both Smackdown 2 for the PlayStation and Smackdown Just Bring It for the PlayStation 2 at almost the exact same time, and they wanted to get Smackdown 2 in stores before the PlayStation 2's release. Whether that's true or not is unknown, but it's possible. The gameplay wasn't really altered at all. The wrestling is still the same. They only made changes in the matches and the overall design of the environments. The game features a few more match types, the most notable being Hell in the Cell. The season mode was also slightly improved, featuring more cutscenes, but like the first Smackdown, it's not a consistent storyline, and the cutscenes for the most part are still very random with no real direction. The game took a bit of a hit graphically. The wrestling models are not quite as realistic as they were in the first Smackdown, and the many weapons and the look of the environment seems a bit more flat this time. This has a lot to do with the scope of the game. Smackdown 2 is a really ambitious game in terms of scale and design for the PS1, and Ukes was forced to tone down certain things in order to fit everything they wanted into the game. So overall, Smackdown 2 is good, but I didn't find it to be as good as the first Smackdown. We have 2 more games to look at. With this game, we entered the N64 world with WWF No Mercy. No Mercy was released in between Smackdown and Smackdown 2 and is the follow-up to WrestleMania 2000, which released the year before. In all honesty, out of all the games that we played so far, No Mercy ranks pretty low on my list. It's not a terrible game by any means, it's just got a few issues. For one, I hate the controls. The N64 controller was never my favorite controller, and this was one of the games that proved why. The controls are not very well responsive, and the move list is a bit large for a controller like the N64 controller. The game also suffers from AI issues. The AI, even on the simplest settings, blocks almost everything you throw at them, and yet getting your character to block is like waiting for a bus. Graphically, the game is pretty good. The N64 obviously had a few more limits than the PlayStation did, but this game looks really good, and the loading times are awesome. So overall, it's an okay game, but doesn't really live up to the high standards that Smackdown made. The last game that we'll look at is the only Dreamcast wrestling game that I own, and that's WWF Royal Rumble. This was both released in arcades and on the Dreamcast. The arcade version was actually a huge hit. In fact, in some of the very few arcades left in the country, this game can still be found. Unlike other Dreamcast ports of arcade games, for instance Crazy Taxi, Royal Rumble doesn't do much to add to the already limited gameplay of the arcade version. There are only 2 match modes in this game, Exhibition, which consists of a few different single matches, and of course the Royal Rumble match. This game is a little bit strange in the way that it's set up, and what I mean by that is the fact that the Royal Rumble match is a 30-man elimination match, and yet the roster on this game only consists of 19 wrestlers. This means that a lot of wrestlers repeat in this game. The game resembles Smackdown in a lot of ways. The game's look and physics are very similar. Graphically, the game looks pretty good. It looks better than Smackdown, but considering that this is the Dreamcast, that doesn't come as a surprise. However, there are a lot of flaws with this game. For one, the hit detection is awful. Sometimes you'll be right next to another wrestler swinging away and you won't hit him. Then there's actually focusing on the wrestlers that you want to hit. The D-pad decides where your wrestler is looking, and that's a huge problem because a lot of times your wrestler will be swinging away at absolutely no one, which makes you an easy target to the other wrestlers around you. The last flaw is actually one of the big innovations in the game. The game allows up to 9 wrestlers in the ring, and guess what? It totally doesn't work. When there's 4 or 5 wrestlers, it's fine, but when there's more than that, it's impossible to see because the action is going way too fast. The game is intense for what it is, but it's one of those games that just makes you wish that you were playing Smackdown. So those are just a few of what is a very long list of older WWE games. It's amazing to see how much these games have evolved. Granted, there have been bumps in the road, but for the most part, the WWE games have been very fun. Well, everyone, that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.